Hello and welcome to Readers Books. My name is Rosie. I'm the events coordinator here, and this is our very second event via Zoom. I have to say, having done a lot of events here in the past, this has got to be a really strange and special way to do it. But if you're going to do it, you should do it for a friend. So tonight we have Iris Jamahl Dunkle here to tell us about Charmian London. Now, in addition to working at Readers Books, I grew up here and I had to learn a lot about Jack London growing up. It was a second grade field trip. It was our reading assignments in 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. And somehow nobody talked about how cool his wife was, possibly quite a bit cooler than Jack London was himself. So we're delighted that this book has finally been written. We wish it could have been written sooner, but the fact that it's done by Iris just makes it so much more special. Iris was the Poet Laureate of Sonoma County from 2017 through 2018, which is when I first got to meet her. But my colleagues here at Readers Books have been working with her on the Napa Valley Writers Conference for the past umpty years. And we're just so happy that the right person wrote this book. The book and all of Iris's poetry books are available at Readers Books. You can give us a call. The number will be 707-939-1779, or you can use our website, which is www.readersbooks.com. Then there you will find her book, her other books, and a plethora of other reading materials that you could enjoy. I am going to cede the floor now to Iris, and she can tell you more about her book, which I'm borrowing here to show you, Charmian London. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. That was such a beautiful introduction, and it indeed feels very special to be reading here with my friends at Readers Books. And this book has been a long time coming, and they have heard the story for many, many years that it was coming. So it's a pleasure to finally get to release it here at this wonderful bookshop. As many of you know, Charmian Kittredge London married the best-selling American author, Jack London, on a cold Chicago night, November 19th, 1905. But the story of who she was before and who she was afterwards, and even who she was during their marriage, has been rarely told and never told in a whole book. So this is really the first biography that takes on Charmian's story from Charmian's perspective. I did a lot of research to write this book, but I still wanted to make it a book that anyone could approach. It reads much like a novel reads. So it's nonfiction, but it reads with that kind of flow. And I'm going to read you several sections from Charmian's life before she met, or not before she met, but before she became married to Jack London. So the first section I'm going to read for you is about Charmian while she was still living with her uncle Roscoe and her aunt Nanetta Ames. When Charmian was 6 years old, she lost her mother. And then when she was 14, she lost her father and she became an orphan. And this was really devastating to Charmian. She was very close to her father. But this is about how this strong woman dealt with this loss. Charmian was to transform her grief at the loss of her father into a fierce sense of self-sufficiency. Her uncle Roscoe L. Ames taught courses and private lessons based on his first book, The Manual of Light Line Shorthand. A few months after her father's death, Charmian asked Roscoe to teach her cursive shorthand method for taking dictation and how to type on the royal typewriter he used for his business. These skills allowed her to work as a clerk at a time when business offices were still not considered appropriate places for women. Until the late 19th century, there were no women in offices at all. With the advent of the typewriter in 1873 and its wider adoption in offices by the 1880s, women began slowly to join the workforce. In 1886, women still made up only 15% of the office workforce. Charmian was not afraid to break with convention, even at 14. In return for Roscoe's lessons, she agreed to become his teaching assistant. The 2 years she spent working with her uncle gave her what she needed to set out on her own with a job outside the Ames's household and the higher education her father had wanted for her. After 2 years working with Roscoe, she was so proficient in this male-dominated field that she could look for a job as a stenographer elsewhere. Close by, the College of Mills, the first college west of the Rockies to grant degrees to women, was just opening its doors, Mills Seminary and College in Oakland. She began working as a secretary to Susan Mills, secretary to Susan Mills, the president and business manager of the college, and in return, she received free room, board, and tuition. This was at a time when most girls ended their education with grammar school. Mills and her husband had served as Christian missionaries in present-day Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and in the Sandwich Islands, which is present-day Hawaii. Given the Mills's connections with these faraway places, it's no surprise that the school attracted students from around the world. Charmian was enchanted to find herself working in an office with thick rugs on the floor, art on the walls, and statues in every spare inch of space. The Mills College office was a place of beauty, and to Charmian's delight, the woman she worked for had not only dreamed of traveling as Charmian had since childhood, but had gone out in the world and experienced it. Charmian enrolled in a non-degree program taking classes in drawing, piano, rhetoric, literature, and art history. She lived on campus in a dormitory room. Life on the spacious grounds of Mills College was a pleasant change from the life in the Ames's household. Here, she could wander the winding paths that followed the flow of Leona Creek and speak with classmates that hailed from far and wide. Her art class was held in a space filled with the customary replicas of classical sculpture, and Charmian would later buy a small copy of the Venus de Milo, which she kept in her room wherever she lived, a reminder of her first taste of independence. In fact, that statue still remains in the House of Happy Walls today. Susan Mills offered Charmian a new way to structure and record her daily life. Every day, Mills College students completed exercises, including a mile-long walk, a ritual Charmian would adopt and practice throughout her life. Even aboard ship, she would find a way to walk around the deck for at least a mile, and more often for 4 or 5. Her innate sense of discipline was valued and encouraged at Mills, and because of this, she began to record in her diary the things she had accomplished. The number of hours she sat at the piano and practiced, the number of miles she walked, and the titles and authors of the books she was reading. Most important, Charmian's life at Mills College gave her a gateway to the rest of the world. Her secret life no longer had to be kept secret. All around her, in the dorms and in her classes, were like-minded young women who aspired to become artists and intellectuals. For once, Charmian no longer felt like an outsider. She was among her peers, all of them accomplished young women, eager to make their mark on the world. So I want to continue on to read another section about, this is after Charmian left Mills College, she got a job working as a stenographer in one of the biggest shipping firms in San Francisco, and she really developed an astounding career. She had a personal assistant, she had a cleaning woman that took care of her home, as you need when you're working full-time. She bought her own horse. She was part of this Overland Monthly crowd that included all kinds of intellectuals from the area. And she was regularly dating men. And at this time, she met Jack London in 1900. But quickly, they had a wonderful time. They immediately clicked, but very soon, Jack decided to marry his first wife. And after that, Charmian decided to go on her own adventure. And so she followed her Kittredge heritage. So on her father's side, the family came from Mount Desert Island in Maine. And her father always wanted her to visit. And so after this interchange with Jack London, she's like, well, I'm just going to take a break and go back east. And so she took the train and stayed with all of her relatives in Mount Desert Island. And then she met a couple who were going to go to Europe and travel around Europe. And so she did that. And that was her first experience of writing about travel, which became really her, the way she wrote. That was kind of like how she began to become a writer. But when she got back, she continued her journey all the way back home to the West Coast. But she went via New York City. She visited her best friend, Pauline French, who she'd met through the Berkeley Overland crowd. And they took a train together from New York City to the Pan American Exposition in 1901. And so this section is about their experience there. Once back in Maine, she began planning the trip back home to the San Francisco Bay Area that would take her to New York City, Buffalo, Newton, Iowa, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. After catching a glimpse of another continent, she was curious to see and eager to write about the tremendous and complex beauty her own country had to offer. Her first stop was a visit with her close friend, the actress Pauline French, in New York City. In Pauline's apartment, Charmian sat with her friend at the kitchen table and read her European travel log aloud. She also showed the photographs she had taken on the journey. Pauline, who had left the Bay Area to act in plays in New York, had traveled widely to Singapore, Hawaii, and Europe, and she must have been impressed to see how her dear friend Charmian had transformed herself into a world traveler. After spending a few days sightseeing, going to the theater, and dining out in the big city, she and Pauline took a train to Buffalo, New York, to visit, quote, Rainbow City, the Pan American Exposition of 1901 that had opened in May that year. What they saw when they arrived on October 22nd, 1901 in Buffalo was a spectacle. 350 acres of colorful domes and spires, ornate porticos and arcades. The first evening, they were mesmerized by the fair's greatest sensation, the illumination. As the colors of the fair's buildings began to fade, Charmian and Pauline walked across the massive expanse of the Triumphal Bridge while patriotic songs played in the background. The bridge was crowned by 4 massive 100-foot pylons. At the top of them stood statues of armed men riding rearing horses. Slowly, across the expanse of the fair, thousands of pinpricks of light eased on, and the glowing outlines of minarets, domes, and arches began to be drawn with light. At the center of the spectacle stood the 375-foot electric tower, crowned with a giant beam of light that could be seen all the way to Canada. Only 1 month earlier, violence had marred the joyful ambiance of the fair. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley had been shot twice by a young anarchist from Cleveland named Leon Soglowski while he was standing in the receiving line at the Temple of Music. The president survived and was rushed to surgery where the wound was repaired, but the bullet wasn't removed. The whole nation followed his progress through newspaper headlines. At first, his prognosis was good. Then his situation became grave as his wound became gangrenous. He died 8 days later on September 14, 1901. The nation was shocked and horrified, but after a brief closing, the fair carried on and opened its gates again to the public. Like most of the guests who visited, Charmian and Pauline took the electric-powered trolley from the fair directly to Niagara Falls to see the vast waterfall that powered the exposition. And on the very day they visited, a 61-year-old woman named Annie Taylor folded herself into a barrel, and went over the Canadian side of the falls. Taylor was lucky and survived the 158-foot drop into the swirling rapids below, becoming the first woman ever to do so. Charmian and Pauline must have heard word of the tremendous feat as they visited the American side of the falls. They spent a day visiting the Lane of Laughter, a midway that offered everything from hula hula women from Hawaii to, quote, a giant seesaw that sent thrill seekers 275 feet up into the air, where the streets were littered with empty peanut shells and everything smelled of stale beer. Exhibits lined the flanks of the midway, including the arched rainbow-colored facade that hosted Frank C. Bostock's Animal Show. Commanding 6-foot-tall ringmaster Frank C. Bostock must have shocked Charmian with the cruelty with which he approached the wild animals featured in his animal show. Even the giant elephant, famed as the largest animal in captivity, Jumbo 2, seemed to cower away from Bostock's touch. In addition to the animals, Bostock featured freak humans as well. One of the main attractions was Chiquita, the doll lady, a 2-foot young woman who was supposedly perfectly proportioned like a living doll. Further along the midway, Charmian and Pauline walked through the electricity building and rode on a trip to the moon, a mechanical dark ride later housed at Coney Island's Luna Park. Perhaps most important, they saw Joshua Slocum's sloop, the Spray, on which he had recently sailed around the world in the first solo circumnavigation of the globe. Charmian, who was an avid sailor on San Francisco Bay, had just read Slocum's international best-selling book, Sailing Alone Around the World, the summer before in Maine. Later, she would introduce Jack London to the book and plant a seed that would eventually grow into their voyage around the South Seas. Yet another thing that Charmian does not get credit for. Charmian approached the fair with all the vigor and desire to document it that had animated her travels in Europe. She took photographs of all that she saw and collected them in her scrapbook. When she left the Illuminated Exposition on the night of October 25th, 1901, she was on a train bound for Chicago en route to Newton, Iowa. Before she boarded the train, she had embraced her dear friend Pauline, who was returning to New York City. How beautiful the fair buildings must have looked, shimmering like jewels in the night as she sped westward. What a universe she had discovered in this past year, and how her appetite for travel grew inside her. I'm going to read one more short piece about a part of Charmian's life that often doesn't get discussed. In fact, in the House of Happy Walls prior to the remodel, which is amazing if you get a chance, those of you who are local, to go to Jack London State Park and visit the House of Happy Walls once it's open again, then you'll see that the exhibits now tell the story of Charmian's life, and I'm very grateful for those changes. Prior to that, you wouldn't have known that Charmian had carried a child to term. And she was someone who very much wanted to become a mother. I want to read this last little piece and dedicate it to my own mother, who I lost 3 years ago, and who very much believed in this project, and taught me to tell the stories of people who had been forgotten. So this is about Charmian's experience of childbirth. Charmian was now 38 years old and due to have her first baby in late June 1910. She sat in the warm sunlight that checkered through the screened-in porch at Wake Robin Lodge, thinking about what it would be like to be a mother. It was May 1910, and she was already well into the final trimester of her pregnancy. She felt uncomfortable in her pregnant body. Quote, "My uncomfortableness keeps me turning and I get so tired of it." She had little memory of her own mother, and her Aunt Netta hadn't exactly been maternal, so the idea of motherhood fascinated her. So far, Charmian's pregnancy had progressed without complication. According to her doctor, the baby was healthy and she had nothing to worry about. She was relieved as she let the sunlight warm her. 3 weeks later, she woke to what felt like severe menstrual cramps. Was this labor, or was it an indication that something had gone wrong? She tried to remain calm, but this was her first baby, so she didn't know what symptoms to expect. When she called Dr. Wright, he assured her that her cramps were from her body getting ready to go into labor. Charmian had spent the months of her pregnancy preparing a layette for her baby. After hanging up the phone after her conversation with Dr. Wright, she packed the tiny baby booty she had knitted herself and the other, quote, necessary baby clothes in a tiny steamer trunk. Then Jack and Charmian took the train to Oakland to stay at their, quote, townhome while they waited for her labor to begin. She was happily anticipating the birth, writing in her diary, quote, just think, I'm going to be a mother. I wonder if it's the sweetest thing in the world, sweeter than wifehood, or only tangled up in supplementing wifehood. After a few days, Charmian went to stay nearby with her friend Elizabeth Bull, where she planned to stay until she went into labor, and then again to recover with the baby after she left Fabiola Hospital. Even at this late stage of her pregnancy, she continued to work, typing and editing Jack's stories. Early that spring, Jack had signed a contract to cover the much anticipated fight between Jack Johnson and James Jeffers in San Francisco for the New York Herald. He and Charmian had watched Jack Johnson defeat Tommy Burns on December 26, 1908 in Sydney, while Jack recovered from surgery at the end of their journey on the Snark. But when Johnson beat Burns and became the first Black heavyweight boxing champion of the world, he wasn't celebrated when he returned to the United States. Instead, he was vilified. The American public was deeply divided racially. Jeffries, a popular and undefeated heavyweight champion who had gone into retirement, was urged by the white press to return for one last fight with Johnson. Previously, Jeffries had refused to fight any Negro challengers. However, to prove the superiority of the white race, he came out of his 6 years of retirement. The fight quickly became the event of the year. The press dubbed Jeffries the quote, hope of the white race, while Johnson was dubbed Negro's deliverer. Anti-boxing crusaders persuaded the governor of California, James Gillette, not to allow the fight, and at the last minute, the venue was moved to Reno, Nevada. Jack, who was one of 5,000 journalists covering the event, found out about the change on June 17th, the day they visited Dr. Wright for Charmian's checkup. Both Jack and Charmian were concerned that Jack might miss his child's birth because he was required to cover not only the fight, but the week-long training camps before it took place. As Charmian wrote, he is, quote, looking white and blue over the switching of the fight to Nevada. I feel pretty blue myself. They felt cheered by the news from Dr. Wright that Charmian's condition was, quote, excellent. He anticipated a healthy delivery. Sadly, Dr. Wright's prediction could not have been more wrong. On the morning of June 19, 1910, Charmian woke with severely swollen arms and legs. As she wrote, circulation bad, pretty much purple all over, marks on my thighs from abdomen pressure. It was no surprise that she was showing signs of strain since her regular weight was a little less than 120 pounds and she was carrying a 9-pound baby. She sat with her feet up most of the day, hoping the swelling would go down. That night, she awoke at 1:30 a.m. to discover she was in labor. Mrs. Bull's son, Arthur, drove her to Fabiola Hospital in Oakland. Jack met her immediately and comforted her through the early part of the labor. During those long hours, Jack, quote, laid his dear curly head beside me and we napped together, I from exhaustion. What followed were some of the most difficult days of Charmian's life. Difficult days with her mate standing steadfast by her side. As she recorded in her diary, quote, then came on the terrible hours when he helped me, breathed with me, loved me, and praised me until I could stand no more and made no headway, and they gave me ether and took my baby from me, and came to and heard her cry and saw the top of her little head, and then she went to the nursery. We named her Joy, mate and I, our Joy baby. He was so good and loved me more than ever. The nursing staff gave Charmian ether because she could not give birth to such a large baby unassisted. and while she was unconscious, Dr. Wright used forceps to deliver the baby. It was a difficult procedure, and it did not go well. Immediately following the birth, Charmian's body went into shock. Still lying unconscious on the operating table, she began to bleed heavily. Dr. Wright quickly assessed that Charmian had a retained placenta and she was in a life-threatening situation. Charmian was rushed into emergency surgery so she would not bleed to death. Charmian recalled in her diary what happened next. Quote, "This was worse yet. The placenta had not come, and there was more suffering under the doctor's cruel, kind hands, and it was no use. So on the operating table I went. Dear mate, and Eliza was here too, and they followed me on my wheeled bed into the surgical building and saw me take the anesthetic, and I knew no more until 3 hours later when I came to in number 9, which was the room I had chosen. The baby was born across the hall, number 8. My mate was wild over the baby girl, blue eyes and wide between the eyes, he said, and he said I was brave and how he loved me twice as much for my grit. After surgery to remove the placenta, Charmian was nauseated and in terrible pain all afternoon. She had not yet met her new baby, except for a brief glimpse at the top of her head. Jack was incredibly relieved that his wife had survived, and he stood by her bedside as she wafted in and out of consciousness, recovering. He fell asleep listening to the tide of her breath. His relief was brief, however, because soon after the doctor entered the room and abruptly asked him to come speak with him outside in the hall. The doctor's face was pale and apologetic as he shared the grave news. The forceps had broken Joy's spine during her birth, and she would not survive. Jack was shocked and then horrified as the realization sank in that he would be the one who would have to tell Charmian. He told his stepsister Eliza, and together they went into Charmian's room to tell her the terrible news. When Charmian looked up and saw Jack and Eliza on either side of the bed, looking sadly down at her, she knew something was wrong. As she recalled, "But oh, the pity of it, our own baby, our little daughter, ours, our Joy baby, gone at 4 a.m, only 38 hours old. In the twilight of the morning, the birth had been too hard. The long, long hours. How broken one can be. But I had my mate, and he loved me, and was sorry for me." Thank you.